Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Si here today to discuss with you more about the Battle of Passchendaele. And in this video, we're going to focus on the plan the British made and their initial attacks in the early months of June towards August. As always, important to stress this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so the context will provide you with some key knowledge, and of course, we'll have some dedicated practice to your historical skills as we go out throughout this series. If you're not already, do check out the first part of this series. We delve into the initial background of ideas, what the situation was like after the Germans conducted their retreat towards the Siegfriedstellung or the Hindenburg Line after the campaign at the Somme. So with that in mind, notepads and pens at the ready, and we shall carry on with our lesson on Passchendaele. The British had a situation, as we established, the French had suffered a massive setback at Nivelle. They had soldiers who were now conducting mutinies. They were giving up on the conflict. The pressure really was on. The German counterattacks and their new defensive depth strategy appeared to be working successfully. However, the British need to come up with a plan. So in 1917, the British still held the Ypres salient all the way in Flanders. It's important to remember that Flanders was where Haig initially wanted to conduct his first major offensive back in December 1915. But because of what happened in 1916 with the Germans' attack at Verdun, and because of where the Somme was positioned, the Somme became the place where the initial attack had to be conducted. However, now because of what had happened at the Nivelle offensive, France's own disarray meant that Haig would now finally get his chance. His plan concerned the railway routes that were all around this area. He understood that the Germans' Fourth Army controlled it and through it could maintain a supply chain all the way up and down their western front because railways were a key form of transferring supplies. It was quick to move soldiers and quick to move ammunition and guns and artillery. So he proposed an attack at Messines Ridge with Herbert Plumer's Second Army. Herbert Plumer is a new gentleman we have here on the left here in the image. We mentioned him very briefly as a proponent of what's called a bind and hold method. We'll get on to detail with that very shortly. So, the plan was simple. Herbert Plumer was going to use the Second Army and relieve the pressure from the French in the south at Nivelle. Plumer was quite knowledgeable about the Ypres salient, and indeed because of his fit as an experienced man in this area from Flanders and the previous Ypres offensives, he was the ideal pick to conduct these attacks. It was planned that Plumer would assault the ridges at Polygon Wood, Bruchshain, and finally take the village of Passchendaele to capture those vital railways that they needed. However, the British politicians, especially Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, remained very unsure. They really feared this was going to become another offensive like the Somme, very reliant on attrition, but this time because the French were having a problem with mass mutinies, they would lack key support from them. Haig countered these concerns by citing a report from the American Relief Committee. This report claimed that German morale was low because they had poor equipment, low rations, and despite the railway lines being in their possession, were still having difficulties transporting those supplies all after the defeat at the Somme. As for the Allies, Haig noted they actually could use some vital Dominion troops, particularly the Canadians and Australian. We've not talked about them much yet, but it's important to remember that the British Empire was wide and vast, and the Canadian and Australian armies provided some vital, experienced, and quality soldiers. And again, we established the BAF was effectively wiped out after failures in 1915 at Aubers Ridge and Lewes, whereas now they had these Dominion troops who were coming in, and some had indeed fought at the Somme and had proven themselves quite worthwhile. It is also worth remembering that these Dominion armies were still full of their professionals and still had large numbers because they weren't really here on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915, so had not suffered those initial losses in those campaigns and carnage. The Canadians quite recently had also had some impressive successes. Notably, they actually had captured the Vimy Ridge from the Germans just before the Nivelle offensive. And this was quite impressive because the French had been trying for months to retake the position, and the Canadians pulled it off on their first real full attempt. Therefore, these fears that without the French they would struggle were quelled by the high number of the Canadian and Australian troops. Haig also suggested that you just never know. This attack could also create the dream breakthrough that they desired, and of course, because of that, they could take the railways and attack the northern ports, and through that, they could also potentially disrupt the German naval and submarine boats that were stationed there. This would also mean the Germans would lose not only their supplies on the front, but also their ability to sink the merchant ships that the British were using to transport their own supplies at home. Now, with this promise of such a decisive blow, the government changed their mind and supported the plan for an attack. But I do want to note something there. As we said in the previous video, one of the lessons that should have been learned at the Somme was the temperament of expectations. They shouldn't really be trying to dream of a breakthrough. Here, Haig was posing that as the dream solution once again. And we're going to notice a pattern with Haig. Despite the lessons learned, he keeps hoping, he keeps dreaming of this breakthrough. That was the plan: take the railways, relieve the French once again, and potentially gather another breakthrough. How was this going to go? Well, let's consider that. Let's get on to the initial stages of that battle. Now, this was the third Battle of Ypres, and it started in June 1917. Now, the attack on Messines Ridge went according to plan. They used a creeping barrage, and it was quite effective. They destroyed many of the German positions, and infantry occupied them once again. They also conducted mining detonations and also destroyed many of the trench networks right underneath them. And the Plumer's Second Army proved quite devastatingly effective. They really had come a long way from the Somme offensive. The Germans were routed, and the ridge was taken in just a week. Impressed, Haig actually ordered Plumer to press on and take Polygon Wood right away, a few weeks ahead of schedule. However, Plumer refused. Why would he refuse? They just had a massive success. Well, he refused because he wanted his men to rest. Remember, a key tenet of the creeping barrage was the artillery was meant to be paired with the infantry. So you had to allow the infantry to rest and then allow the artillery to catch up, move its positions, come closer, and conduct the next attack. Haig lacked this patience, though, and he actually replaced Plumer as leader of the attack with Hubert Gough. This man was more attack-minded, much more in line with what Haig desired. So the idea became clear. Gough was going to lead the attack, not Plumer. Bit of a decisive change to make in the middle of the campaign. However, one thing Haig could not control was the weather. The summer rain really set in and fell hard upon the salients here, meaning that Gough had to actually delay the attack anyway and wait until July when the rain began to calm down before launching the next attack regardless. Gough unleashed a massive artillery bombardment on the area in the meantime. However, this bombardment had a bit of a flaw. It launched over 4 million shells with 3,000 heavy artillery cannons, but it actually, once again like at the Somme, failed to really destroy much of the German fortifications and pillboxes. But what the bombings did destroy was the plumbing systems under the town. This was a massive problem because by destroying the plumbing systems, where could all the sewage and muck and mud go? It could only go up onto the land above it. And so, because of the bombings, it all spewed out onto the land and poured out all over the landscape. Compounded by the heavy rainfall, this left the area a dreadful mess. You can see with the images on the screen what the landscape actually transformed into. There's an evident situation of mud and sewage in every one of the images. The men, even as we see here, walking, carrying their wounded in these conditions as well. Tanks once again are getting stuck in the mud. And even like the forestry around it, the trees are battered and it's charred. It's an awful place to be. These images, as you can see, courtesy of the Imperial War Museum. And this is the tragic situation for the British. Despite their efforts, despite the bombing, they've just made the terrain worse and they've made it even more difficult for them to traverse and, of course, get through. As I said, the tanks, of course, they were used, but they were getting stuck in the mud. The infantry were having a hard time running in the mud as well, trying to climb and charge up the hills, not down them, was really difficult, and it slowed the offensive. Remember, a key reason offensives work is because they're quick, because they're fast, because they move so quickly, the Germans can't respond and adapt their positions in time. But because of the terrain, it was just simply too slow. And before you know it, Gough's men are committing large lines of infantry into the German machine guns after the bombardment. And this is uncannily the same mistake Rawlinson made at the Somme in 1916. Thousands were dying once again for little ground, and the Germans counterattacked rather easily because it was always much easier to run down these hills rather than to charge up them. Gough's efforts to take Langemarck with the Ulster divisions proved futile as well. The terrain was simply too difficult to cross at speed, especially as another 3 days of heavy rain only worsened what was now officially quagmire rather than smooth land. Any chance of a breakthrough was lost, and as the summer ended and autumn began to set in, Haig had no choice but to relent and allow Plumer to retake control and change the battle back to one of fight and hold and a campaign of attrition. So, the initial stages of Passchendaele between June and August, do they remind us of another campaign so far? Does it sound like the Somme? Well, maybe it is. There's some clear evidence that indeed that is the case. Haig once again had insisted on an attack, of achieving a breakthrough rather than doing a fight and hold more attritional style of war. The weather was not clear crisp summer, it was a lot more rain, it was a lot more mud, and it really just weakened the efforts of the British to attack. In a lot of ways, this really was reminiscent of the failures of 1916 at the Somme once again. But the attack is not over yet. Very similar to those first mistakes that happened at the Somme. The British are going to get a retry. We're going to have a change of leadership back to Plumer. And the question we should be thinking, will this situation actually change? Will it improve? Well, that's what we're going to find out in our next video. Again, do feel free to put in the comments below what you believe is how they're succeeding. Are they struggling? Is this all too much like the Somme? Or maybe we should give some credit here. Maybe it's the German strategy we established, this idea of defense in depth, using the stormtroopers and launching those counterattacks. Is that proving all too successful? It's tough to say, but what we do know, what we can say, is when the creeping barrage was being used at the Battle of Messines Ridge at the start of this campaign, it was a renowned success. It only took a week to take it. Should they have changed strategy at all? I'll let you make that judgment for yourself in the comments below. Thank you once again for listening and taking part in my lesson. Hope to see you again for the concluding part on this campaign. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.